Next up, we'll deal with the German term Lus. And so this is pronounced, I'm pronouncing it wrong, but who cares? It's L-U-S. It's how we'll kind of think about how to pronounce this. Lus deposits. Essentially what it is just wind-blown, fine-grained silts. We can find a blanket of this fine-grained silt sediment across much of the Great Plains and Indiana. We'll get to that here in a minute. But the idea here is this loess deposits leaves behind very dark, very fertile soils. And so we'll talk about soils in a future lecture, but the darker it is, typically the more organic or more nutrient-rich it is. So what we also can associate with these loess deposits are great soils for ag. And so that's one of the things about corn. Corn just takes nutrients. It's awful for the soil. And it requires extremely rich soils, which we find in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and other places in this area. The key as far as where we find a good amount of loess deposits are the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys. And so one of the things we find thicker deposits on the eastern side of the river valleys and floodplains due to the prevailing westerlies. And so we think about this loess, we typically find it near floodplains, alluvium, once again fine-grained sediment. We find these along rivers, but for the most part, because of the predominant west to east pattern as far as our wind, it's going to create these deposits that are going to be more found on the eastern sides of rivers. So we'll come back to this when we look at Indiana. So in the southwestern part of Indiana, we find a good amount of these loess deposits that are very close, very much at the surface. We find these deposits more likely on the eastern side of the Wabash River, on the eastern side of the White River West Fork, and then also to a lesser extent on the eastern side of the East Fork. So this is, for the most part, we're going to find this on all rivers, the eastern side. More characteristic as far as having loess deposits. We'll also look a little bit later on at China, where they have a very similar situation. We'll come back to this when we look at glaciers in a future lecture, but essentially the same ice sheet that is over Greenland was over here, over us in Indiana. And so these ice sheets, think about these suckers being at times a mile thick from surface to the top of the ice sheet, from the ground surface, from the lithospheric surface. So just imagine a mile thick sheet of ice, how it just pulverizes and turns everything in its path into powder. So as it pulverizes and turns everything into powder, essentially, think of it just crunching up everything. Think about a cereal box. What you find at the bottom, that fine-grained sediment that's kind of left over. So when the glaciers melt, they then just essentially drop that fine-grained sediment. That sediment is just dropped and left in place. Over time it dries out, and then we get the predominant westerly pattern. And so we can find, if you look at this map here that shows the extent of the most recent glacial period, it kind of falls along the line that falls along where the Ohio River and the Missouri River both are, which we then see here as far as where the areas of loess deposits are in much higher amounts. And so, once again, go back and to the map quiz 2 or whatever 3. Look at where the Mississippi River is. And so the Mississippi River forms the border between Mississippi, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. If we look here, where do we see the deposits? We see the deposits on the eastern side of the Mississippi. Same goes for much of the area to the north here, where we've got the Missouri River. So the idea here is the glacier extent. We can find at the Ohio and the Missouri River, we see all that pulverized, everything in its debris path, humans or whatever's in the path, pulverizes and turned to dust, and then eventually melted and left in place, where then Aeolian processes cause these deposits to collect on the eastern side of river valleys. And if we zoom into Indiana, we can see this. And so we can see along the eastern side of the Wabash, we see, as the brown illustrates, these higher quantities, higher concentrations of loess deposits. We find loess all over the place, but it's where we find it in thicker quantities would be over here in the extreme southwestern side of Indiana. We're going to come back and explain a little bit more. Okay, well, why is this area so specific as far as why we see loess deposits? And like I said, it has to do with glaciers. So we'll come back and explain. Well, what are these? What's that yellow line? What's at the top that kind of that maroon line? What those are extent, or the boundaries, or the ends of where a continental, large, massive glacier ice sheet went. So we'll see these deposits in the extreme southwestern part of Indiana. And then what this is showcases one of these loess deposits, almost like a sand dune in a sense, but this deposit that's collected and creates these cliffs that you can see. Now, not extreme cliffs, but cliffs that you'll see typical along eastern side of a lot of rivers that flow through Indiana, especially here in southwestern Indiana, which is where this image actually is from the one of the sides of the Wabash River, just further up from the current floodplain. Now, a little bit later on, we'll come back to this when we talk about glaciers, but this area of Indiana we can identify already as an area where we see a collection of lush deposits. And so, of course, our Indiana rivers come through here, and pretty much if we look at the eastern side of both the Wabash, but also the Western Fork, and even parts of the Ohio, way down there by Evansville, so we can see this predictable pattern. And it all has to do with the extent, it's all to the south, of this red line. This red line is the most recent glacier, the end of the most recent glacier as far as where it went the furthest. It didn't go any further, and so it's where it stopped. So we'll come back to that idea. Why is this area, why do we see this sediment beyond the line to the south of this red line? We'll come back to explain that when we look at glacial processes. Here's the Loess Plateau in China. So this is where the Huanghe River comes through, and it carries. We can see this river carrying that silt, carrying that loess. So it gives it that yellow color. And so this is called the Yellow River because of the characteristic color of the sediment and the huge amount of sediment that's being carried. As this carves out, you can see this area here, this plateau of this loess that's just easily erodible and getting carved deeper and deeper and deeper over time. And we can actually see where these are actually carvable. I don't know if that's a word. Carvable so much that people can actually live and habitate within. I actually have some grad student buddies who went to this locale and stayed the night in one of these earthen structures in which these families have over time, actually neighborhoods that have been built into these loess deposits and these cliffs.